Hey everyone, my name is Ammar. I debated for Trinity and I was a member of the national team in 2023 and 2024. So, today's motion is about an alternate reality where there exists this technology that lets you transfer disease between people. So, for example, where if I had pneumonia, I could give it to someone else and they'd have it and I'd be fine. So, when you're talking about these kinds of motions where you have an alternate reality, especially on side proposition, you need to be very thorough with your setup of the world because the second that the debate starts, everyone in the room's thinking, okay, what does this look like? How is this going to work? What's going to happen? So, on prop, you need to be very specific about what's going to happen in your world. And when you do this, you don't want to be rambling on about like all sorts of details. It's not about being specific, it's about being strategic. What I mean by this is you need to be thinking of what the other side is going to say. So on prop, you likely know that opposition is going to bring up an argument about maybe a black market or about people not being aware of what they're getting themselves into, or that the scientific community themselves don't know what's happening, or that like there's going to be all sorts of stuff, right? So on prop, you say that you're going to have heavy regulations against a black market. Maybe say that there's going to be like intense penalties and fines if you're caught like doing this illegally. Say that you're going to have widespread awareness campaigns so that everyone knows that this technology exists and what exactly the side effects involved are. Say that before the procedure happens, they're going to have a medical team like scan the person going through it and like make sure that they know what the consequences of them taking on the disease are. Maybe say that there's going to be government funded research into the different types of procedures that you can do using this technology. Say that this is going to be limited to maybe like legal adults taking on diseases only, and that if you know that someone's going to die as a result of taking on, say, a cancer or something, that you're not going to allow this procedure to go through. On opposition, setting up the debate, you need to be. There are two types of setup that you do here. I think the first is you need to make counterclaims about what you think the world is going to look like instead. So you say that no, we think that there's likely going to be a black market and stuff, and that even if there's awareness that people really aren't going to process it, of course you're going to have to like establish this and substantiate it later down in your case, but you make those claims initially up top, give a couple of like reasons why, and then substantiate it further later down in your case. And also the second type of setup that you need to do here is that you need to re-establish things about the status quo that are helpful to your case. What I mean by this is, for example, here you'd point out that in the status quo the sale of organs is illegal because we understand that even if you're in a terrible situation, you ought not be allowed to compromise a part of your body in that kind of way, right? So you establish that about the status quo as well. And then you move on into the case. All right. On proposition, I think that there are two possible strategies you can take. The first is in saying that we're not going to have a commercial use of this technology. What do I mean by this? I mean that you're going to limit this technology only to like volunteers and people transferring diseases between their loved ones. So, for example, if I had a son and my son had a bad case of pneumonia, I take on that pneumonia because I have a better like immune system than him, and I survive through it, allowing both my son and myself to survive and creating a better world for all of us. The second strategy that you could run is that no, we are going to commercialize this, which you say that if you're someone who is poor, that you're able to go through this procedure, take on maybe a couple infections or like terrible allergic reactions for a couple days, and make some money to see your family through a particularly tough time that you may be going through. Now, obviously, in response to this, Op is going to bring up an argument talking about how that is terribly unethical and really, really bad. So, on prop, when you're running this specific argument, what you really need to highlight is the fact that for most people in the status quo, especially those who are economically disadvantaged, better options don't really exist. For example, people may work things like construction jobs where they have to inhale a bunch of asbestos or work like really dangerous jobs because that's the only thing that's available to them. So all in all, you're actually maximizing choice for a group of like disadvantaged individuals. And then on top of that, you also point out that given that there's going to be awareness campaigns and that given that people still have some like level of common sense and understanding of, okay, if I take on this disease, I'm going to feel this type of way, that people aren't exactly as stupid as opposition wants to believe. And therefore we think that people are in a position where they can make this choice for themselves and that we should let them make this choice for themselves. The third argument that I think you need to be running on proposition is one about scientific research. What I mean by this is that you essentially highlight that the way that human beings understand disease and how to cure disease is by basically analyzing people who have them and running scientific experiments, right? So now, when you have the ability to transfer diseases between people, maybe say different individuals with like different genetic makeups, or people with different immune conditions, or even being able to like analyze people knowing that they're definitely not going to die, like having a sample pool that is not under significant risk, for example, by say transferring the disease to like a person with a strong immunity, right? You can have better forms of research, and that overall down the line, as a result of this, you save a whole bunch of lives, and then you impact it out, and that makes a very, very strong argument for your side, right? What do you say in response to this on-site opposition? So the first argument that you run. So let's assume that proposition runs the whole case, including like the commercialized aspect of it, right? Like they say that people can take on diseases if they want to make some money. You say that this leads to exploitation of the poor very, very quickly. And I think that this is a fairly intuitive argument and one that you can run with like a very emotional line pretty strongly, but you're also going to have to substantiate it quite a bit. And what I mean by this is that the burden that you have in this particular argument is what I mentioned before. It's in analyzing why exactly sickness is really, really bad in comparison to anything else. So you bring up the thought experiment about how the sale of organs is illegal in the status quo. Talk about how maybe say that people will be desensitized to this because to us in a world where this technology doesn't exist, the idea of taking on a disease for some that someone else had sounds terrible. But in a world where people just like do it on a regular Thursday afternoon, it isn't as awful, mean that you're likely going to take on worse and worse things because in your mind it's desensitized. So talk about how that like leads to a slippery slope of people taking on diseases that are really, really bad for them, and how you basically shove poor people into a corner, and how even if that maximizes their choice, it doesn't do so in a good way, and is not something that we as a society should be endorsing in any way, shape, or form. Essentially, you need to run a very, very strong, like emotional rhetoric line, which you should be able to do, like call proposition heartless, right? I think the other argument, the other line of analysis to run, which is if they run the whole thing about like taking on diseases on behalf of your loved ones, talk about why that isn't exactly a good thing, right? Say that if you are a parent who may not want to take on a disease because say your immunity is weak, or like your line of work requires you to be optimal or like functioning at like a high level, right? Say that the moment you don't take on this disease, you feel a sense of guilt because it's been conditioned into you that in order to be a good parent you need to be someone who takes on diseases, right? Say that like now society looks at you that even if you don't feel guilty about yourself, society sees you as a worse parent for not doing that, and because of this you create a pressure on parents and like essentially loved ones in general to be taking on diseases on behalf of people. Like, say, for example, if like in cultures where filial piety is like a very, very strong thing, where now you may feel obligated to take on diseases on behalf of your parents as a form of repayment for what they've done, like raising you throughout their lives, right? And also, you need to talk about the flip of this. Talk about how, when you're a child, like let's say that you're a child who's maybe 4 or 5 years old, who's like conscious enough to know what's going on, that's going to leave a significant impact on you. Like when you see your parent like struggling on bed, uh, finding it difficult to breathe, and like having a really, really uncomfortable, tough time, that's not a fun experience. That's not something that you want to see. So even though you feel like you've escaped, or even though you've escaped the disease, your parent is taking the brunt of it for you, and that causes a lot of psychological pain. And talk about that aspect of it as well, and say that in the world as it exists currently, even though you may not be saving as many people, you don't force that level of guilt onto individuals, and because of that the world is a better place. I think the third argument that you need to run here is the counter to the research argument, which is that on prop, although they say that you have better forms of research, on op you point out that research as a whole may not really exist as strongly in their world. Why? Because a very strong driving force of research into disease are rich, powerful, wealthy, elite individuals, because they care about longevity, because they do things like use their philanthropy to fund like scientific research, because they are the people who set up like grants and stuff, grants and awards in universities that lets these researchers do what they do. So because of this, since now as a richer individual you can likely just find someone to offload your disease to, because you no longer have that like existential fear of disease, you're less likely to be funding those kinds of things in the first place. And because of that, scientific research, even though the capacity for it increases, does not happen as strongly. So, on the whole, in the long run, it is only on site opposition that you find a better world for people. So, those are the lines of analysis and the lines of argumentation that I personally had in mind. Obviously, this is not an exhaustive list. So, if there's anything else which you guys think that you could run, or if you disagree with me and say think that something I said might have been stupid, do make sure to comment down below. Hope you guys enjoyed, and see you in the next video.